delighted to be having a return chat on this episode with author, creator, Andrew Aydin. Andrew, welcome. Thanks for stopping by.
Hey, Jason, thank you so much for having me.
Anytime, anytime. Always glad to talk with you. And I know we just had the chance to prove that we are real human beings outside of Zoom at Heroes Con. It was great to see
That's
you there
right.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great to see you. You put in an impressive amount of steps over 3 days.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I, I,
The
s-
Epsom salts are good to us.
yeah, I stood behind a table very efficiently. I think was my contribution. Wrote my name, and you helped me pass that time with your kind words and your company.
Absolutely, absolutely. Glad to stop by and say hello. And I tapped Sarah Meyer on the shoulder across from you. They've contributed to some of the work, I believe. And then you were right next to Chris Sparks. So good company, good neighbors.
Yeah, I liked our neighborhood. I'm surprised they didn't raise the property taxes on it.
I know, I know. Well, you were in the section right next to where they were doing concessions last year. They didn't do that back there this year, but had that happened, I bet they would have done something with the taxes on you. I bet they would have.
Right. Yeah. Although with us and the Appalachian Comics Project, we should have brought our own CSA.
True, very true.
We
Yeah.
had some good vegetables, but we were a little early in the season. The tomatoes are just starting.
They are. They're doing well. My dad's tomatoes are taking off, and we've already traveled into Appalachia and talking North Carolina things. And I'm originally from West Virginia, so that region very near and dear to my heart. And I know that we're talking about the Appalachian Comics Project on this episode.
Well, and I got to meet one of your fellow West Virginians at Heroes Con.
Yes.
It was actually members of the Hatfield family. Uh,
Wow.
I was pretty shocked. I didn't, I was excited, I was like, and I did ask, I was like, so are you guys still trying to, you guys still fight? And they're like, not
Uh-huh.
really. And I was like, and then there was like that pause of like, well, that one, and they were just super nice. And it was kind of exciting in a weird way to put like a human family face to that name you grow up hearing so much.
Yeah. The legend, the
Right.
story that gets passed down. I remember I went to like an outdoor theatrical production of the Hatfields and McCoys as a young person, as like a teenager. That was one of our class trips.
Well, and the part of the story they don't tell, which they should, which is and then they went to a comic convention. Like,
Exactly.
that's where they
And
made
it all
peace.
became happy.
Right, right.
Yeah. Now, Ryan Oakley, I don't think was far from you. Are you familiar with Ryan's work?
Very much so. I was
Yeah.
introduced.
Yeah, I was introduced as well. I think I'm going to have Ryan on the show sometime soon, and did not realize there was like a Wake Forest, North Carolina connection there as well.
Oh, I did not know that. Oh, that's
An alum.
cool. Oh, that's
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah. This
So,
small world of comics, and I know that you're working in, is it Good Trouble Productions? Is that right?
well, that's sort of like the business name. We really run two imprints. Good Trouble Comics, which is
Hmm.
kind of the comics no one else would dare to make.
Love it, love it.
Things about constitutional amendments, and we just, in fact, we're recording this on July 1st, on July 2nd. So probably by the time someone listens to this, it will be out. We're releasing Comics of the Movement #1, which is a reprint of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, paired with the SNCC comics that were produced in Lowndes County in
Mm-hmm.
1966, which are actually the first appearance of a Black Panther in the mid-century comics. They predate
Wow,
Fantastic 452 by like several months, in fact.
that's
And
amazing.
that kind of upends Stan Lee's story because they always, when he would reference it, he would say, you talk about the Black Panther Party, which of course was not in Lowndes County, that was founded in San Francisco.
Hmm.
And again, the South being overlooked in the course of evaluating history, but these were comics that were made as part of the effort to mobilize first-time Black voters who'd been newly enfranchised through passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And there's this hilarious historic occurrence when you think about where all this comes from. The Alabama parties had to have a mascot on the ballot, right? You think of literacy tests, but you forget that they were made even more absurd by the fact that there was this tacit acknowledgement that many people who couldn't read were still allowed to vote if they were white, and the way they sort of directed them to vote is that they had each party have a mascot. And we think of Democrats as having a donkey, but in Alabama, the Democrats' mascot was a rooster.
Uh,
And this is a story that's been relayed to me several times by different people who were there. And they said, we had to pick a mascot for the party because they essentially were running candidates because they couldn't get black candidates on the Democratic ticket or the Republican ticket. So they ran their own party so that they could have first time black candidates. And they like, okay, we need a mascot. We need something that can eat that rooster. And
uh,
so they picked the Black Panther,
uh,
and based the image off of the mascot for Clark Atlanta University,
oh, okay.
part of the AUC in Atlanta, right? And it makes sense. A lot of these SNCC staffers in particular either traveled through Atlanta or were from Atlanta. And so they were very familiar with the Atlanta University Center. And just made sense. And so they put it up on a billboard, and then they made these comics. One called Us Colored People, which is sort of a um, like kind of this beautiful philosophical meditation in a way, but also very direct and poignant about the experiences of Black people under Jim Crow, but and also now with the vote as they embark on this. And then they made to go with that a series of comics on each one of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, the Black Panther candidates. And it
Hmm.
explains not just who the candidates are, this is the part that I loved about it, but they explained what the role of each elected office was and all of their powers. Like, for instance, one of the elected
The
offices was the
autopsy.
medical examiner.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
the medical examiner becomes the sheriff when the sheriff is out of the county under 1966 Alabama law in Lowndes County. Um,
Uh,
and these are things like you're reading through this and you're like, well, could somebody make this for like every election? You know what I
right.
mean? And they're fantastic. They're made by Jennifer Lawson and Cortland Cox, and you may remember Cortland Cox was actually one of the SNCC leaders who helped John Lewis rewrite his speech at the 1963 March on Washington. And we paired them because the SNCC comics in Lowndes County are more closely resemble what you think of as like a zine, right? Like they
Uh,
hand drawn in a Freedom House. In fact, the Val DeLandro variant cover that we made for Comics Movement #1 shows the Freedom House. It's embedded in the image. Um, that was actually the house that Jennifer drew these comics in. And so they're very simple. They're easy to make. Like people could replicate this, right? And it's paired with Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story because it's in some ways I'm trying to say like if you read March, it was like the Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story of its time, right? It educated, sensitized, inspired people. Now I need we all need everyone needs people to go out and follow the next part of the path, which is what
hmm.
SNCC did, going in organizing in a grassroots way in places that are overlooked, in places that have been under resourced, and make comics and explain how our government works and who the people are in these local offices that are incredibly important that have tremendous powers, um, so that we can you know survive. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's the idea, right? And I kind of write this out in the essay at the front of it. But then you also get to hear well, there's both an interview that we did with Cortland and Jennifer, as well as like in their own words explaining how and why they did it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is something where, it took me 2.5 years to actually find reproducible copies because, obscure zines from Lowndes County in the 60s aren't easy to find.
Mhm.
And it's kind of, that's the epitome of what we do. Like, no one else would take this on. I get to, along with many of the people who helped make March, and we've made all these, and we made Run and so many other things. We get to follow this curiosity and this passion and bring something to the comic book stands that would never otherwise be there. And that's sort of our Good Trouble Comics line. Um,
Yeah.
and then Appalachian Comics.
Nice. Nice. Yeah.
But that's Appalachian Comics is this big personal thing. Like we were talking about when we first hopped on, and the storm, uh, Hurricane Helene, when it hit, I mean, it did so much damage physically to people,
Hmm.
to people's mental health. Um, but at the same time, it created a situation where the worst could have come out. And in fact, it didn't. In many ways, the opposite did. Um, there was things that went wrong, people who lost their lives, people narrowly escaping with their lives. Tremendous stories of heroism and just raw desire to survive, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and for those who don't know, I live in Western North Carolina. I live in Edneyville, North Carolina, which is the town next to Batcave and Chimney Rock, two of the towns that were largely swept away, is a nice way to put it.
Hmm.
Um, and so for us, when it hit, um, we were trapped. We were surrounded. My house was surrounded on three sides by water. Was cut off from my neighbors. Um, Even if you could get onto the road, then there were literally hundreds of trees that had fallen on the roads between us and anywhere near town. Um, and it was it's this powerful experience you'll never forget. It was the first time I've ever felt like I felt genuine fear about, like, is this when society collapses? There was no access to the internet. There was no power, right? People didn't have clean water. Um, but it became an amazing story of resilience.
Hmm.
And now, almost 8 months, 9 months after the storm, this second wave of destruction is happening with the region, where small businesses are closing, um, and the dominoes from those effects are putting people in very difficult situations. And so we try to do something, make a history of what happened during Helene, and we call it Islands in the Sky. This is our first project under the Appalachian Comics Project, and we've got it launched on Kickstarter now. We're 2/3, give or take, of the way to our funding goals, so we need everybody's pledge. But there's a lot of cool stuff because we've had creators donate to help. Um, you know, you can chat by a half hour hanging out with Brian Michael Bendis or Matt Fraction, or you can, me, which costs less. Um, and I'll look at your nonfiction comics idea because that's usually what people want to talk about. Um, and what we're doing though is we're pairing these creators who are such great storytellers with the survivors themselves, who then co-author their story.
Nice.
And they
Nice.
get paid. The writers are donating their time, bless them, and they get a professional writing credit, and they get to have worked with these amazing comic creators. And in the end, our hope is to have this firsthand account of what happened,
Mm.
because the part that was so jarring to many of us is that by the time we did get back on the internet, there was all this malarkey going around about what actually happened, and there are people who weren't there or people who came in to be tourists and take photos of damage, making up stories, telling things that didn't happen, to get clout on the internet, or in some cases for political purposes.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
if we let that stand and there's not a first person account that's easily accessible, um, then we're sort of letting the worst parts of the internet create a false memory for all of us.
Yeah. On that goes with a trend of what happens sometimes in the region and in other regions, which is other people trying to tell your story for you. And as you were saying with the comics movement in even rural areas, you were blowing my mind with that because when I think of comics with an X, underground, uh, homemade sort of homebrewed comics, I think of larger urban areas. So how cool and interesting that this is also something that was happening and happening in these political and social ways in areas in the South as well.
I mean, it's the epitome of what SNCC stood for, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
was they embraced storytelling and art and culture in ways that most nonviolent civil disobedience organizations didn't. It's one of the things that separated them, right? Like we still remember all the the iconography of the black and white hands clasped, the John Lewis poster saying "Come build a new world together," the photography of Danny Lyons and others. They were fantastic storytellers. So it only makes sense that, especially considering some of these students were in fact inspired by Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, having read it in 57, 58, 59, 60, and even later. Um, that they would do this, right? It's just an extension. They were already running the SNCC Student Voice, which is a
Mhm.
fantastic representation of what you can do with, I mean, a typewriter and a mimeograph machine. I mean, it was beautiful. It was run by Julian Bond up until he was elected to the House of Representatives, and so it was very much part of their ethos. And I think right now we're all sort of struggling with like the internet is uh, not what it once was. And how do we communicate with each other? We have this desire to make, but every time we make, we're making for a large platform that has algorithms that choose who sees it and all this sort of stuff. And I think we're all craving that, like, here, let me hand you something I made and you can sit down and read it. Right. And I
Mhm.
think it's interesting too, because you bring up comics COMIX. These predate Crumb. And a lot like this would have been these are tremendously important historic artifacts because they reframe the long narrative around independent comics of the 60s.
Mhm. Yeah. The Appalachia has this wonderful history of storytelling, of narrative tradition, of literacy practices widespread. So here we also have comics and visual literacy happening in this way too.
Well, and that's why we felt like the Appalachia Comics Project was so important for us to start. Um, I read, after the storm, you're kind of emotionally processing. You're just also still just trying to chop up all the trees and make sure you're not going to get hit with a widowmaker. Um, and so it was the narrative, the perception of what had happened was very much on my mind because it seemed like it was in the public eye and then went away very quickly. And the only times it was
Mhm.
mentioned was when it became a political football. And so I have this belief that many people's best ideas actually come through their graduate thesis, right? Sometimes they're simple, but they have these universal truths that you can recognize at that age doing that kind of work. And maybe I'm biased because I think for me, my graduate thesis played a huge role in my life, right? The history of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, and how that was used to inspire the earliest acts of civil disobedience in the movement, right? And that became our blueprint for how we published March, and then uh, um, like went on tour and treated it much differently than just like, hey, we're selling a book, right?
Mhm.
So I started reading theses. My therapist has a field day with this. I started reading theses. Is it theses? Theses? Is that
I
plural?
think it actually is, which
Yeah.
sounds so terrible, doesn't it? That
Yeah.
you're like, I got a stack of theses right here. I'm working through. I mean, yeah.
Well, you've probably been there.
Yes.
So I'm reading theses about sort of the depictions in the history of Appalachia, right? And I came across one written by a woman named Elon Justice for the MIT as part of her work at the MIT Media Lab. And I think it was published in 2021. And there's these tremendous documentation and just references just showing how long Appalachia's narrative has been controlled by people not from Appalachia. Um,
Hmm.
and largely what that yields, and she does a great job of making the case, is that it allows these people who are controlling the image and the narrative to then control Appalachia. And she proposes a solution that essentially is a co-authorship model, right?
Hmm.
And it is, I'm she's talking primarily in her thesis about film and television, but it's applicable across mediums, and that obviously catches my eye. I'm like, I know something about co-authorship, and I think the amount of money it would take to build a sustainable initiative of film and television writers coming from Appalachia being paired with experienced professionals. It's just like it, it'd be expensive. It'd be really hard. I mean, I'm pragmatic if nothing else in the projects I try and take on, but it seemed perfect for comics,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? We're small, we're nimble. Um, you can make different types. Sometimes they can be expensive, sometimes they can not be. And also, if you've read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, there is a long history of appreciation for comics in Appalachia. I started reflecting on that as like, well, this is where I got first introduced to comics. My grandmother
Hmm.
took me to the Piggly Wiggly and bought me Uncanny X-Men, right? And it started that, so how I am, plans started to form.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and that was sort of where we started. And then uh I also started to understand why progress is so slow in Appalachia, because then I went, I had my contacts from the old days, and I went and talked to some foundation folks who had been in DC and were working in the arts and that sort of stuff. And I either got blank stares or an incredulous reaction, or in some cases, just like, I don't know, it wasn't good. Um, and I mean, this is the problem, right? Like, it's just, it doesn't, if you've never been here, if you don't know the people, you have experienced that controlled image, you have false expectations of the reality, and then that clouds your judgment when it comes to evaluating new ideas, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so that's why we ultimately had to turn to Kickstarter, because we put up as much money as we could afford, myself and my partners, um, essentially as much money as we could afford to lose and still keep the company afloat. Um, and we still to get it printed, to because another part of this was so important to us, is with the survivors who are co-writing their story should be paid. They're doing work, and there are people
Hmm.
here who need money. And so what often happens, right, is the wildest, most harrowing stories, or the ones that people suffer tremendous loss. And not all the stories are lost, but it was like everybody went through something, right? And everybody could use just a little bit of help right now. And so that's why we decided to do it this way as best we could. It just, sometimes I think we get paralysis of analysis, right? Like, how do we fix this problem? I'll write a report. And
Hmm.
our version was like, okay, we're just going to start making a book. And it was amazing, the response, because we put out a news article in a tiny paper here in the region, Smoky Mountain News. Shout out, but no disrespect to the Mountaineer. It's sister paper in the same town. Um, and these rivalries are serious.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. I love them both. But the Smoky Mountain News printed our article. And within 24 hours of that publication, we got 36 submissions and requests to participate. Like, the
Nice.
response was
Nice.
was overwhelming, and we were like, we can't make all of these stories. We have to pick. I still want to go and make more of them if we can find the funding. Um, or if everybody buys them and then we can afford to make more, that's the other solution. Um, because this is also a model. I mean, these stories are good. Like I'm reading
Hmm.
the scripts as they come in, and they're just good. I'm uh like I kind of want some folks to take some notes from these Appalachian people. Like they're
Yeah.
storytellers, right? In some cases it's like Nick Filardi is writing a story with his wrote a story with his wife. Nick's been a colorist in the industry for years. He lives in Fletcher. Is in fact been is a colorist on one of my series, Taste of Justice for DC Comics.
Hmm.
And no one's ever asked him to write a story. And then he turns in this beautiful story called Ripples, and it really focuses on the two sides of water, where there's so much water coming down, there's so much flooding, and yet nobody has clean water. And what do you
Hmm.
do? And the fear and all these other sort of things that come out of it. And he's taking care of his neighbors who lived on the first floor, whose apartment is completely flooded out. And they're trapped, all of them, in this apartment for days, just trying to survive. Um, and there's more to it, and there's lots of other stories. But to me, it's like, well, how has Nick been in comics for, I don't know, 10, 15 years? Nobody's asked him, why don't you write a story, right? And yet
Hmm.
he
Hmm.
turns in this beautiful story. And that's also part of the goal, right? Like now I think you're gonna see some writers come out of this. And this
Yeah.
goes to the power of co-authorship, where like you give them an opportunity, you help them, you make sure they feel supported, but also allow their voice to come through. Um, and that's why Appalachia has struggled to tell its own story for so long, because nobody will give them the chance.
Yeah. I imagine it was rewarding work, and there was a lot of thought put into some of the co-authorship and some of the ways that creators got to pair up with some of these voices.
Yeah, we tried very hard to make sure that well, first when we put out the mass call, it was always like that person will handle a trauma person pretty well, right? You know,
Hmm. Hmm.
because creators can be a little weird. And all the people that we reached out though are just fantastic human beings. And so, but there was that moment before we did it where we were like a little nervous, like, how are we gonna balance this? And then it really came together naturally, because some writers brought along their usual creative collaborators to do the art,
Hmm.
and so they were just natural teams, and you would be like, what kind of story they do really well? Animals, right? Like because
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
um and so it was fun to pair them with people like that too, where like the first one of the survivors that I met that I hadn't met before the storm, because some of the folks I knew from beforehand, which was crazy. Um, I was like, "What is it like? Like, are you enjoying it?" He's like, "Dude, I can't believe I'm working with Greg Pak." And he's like all
Right, right.
excited, and you're like, "Yes, that's also the part. It's fun." Like,
Yeah.
so it's been really beautiful to see. I wish we could do a lot more of this, because I think the what happened in Helene is a omen. I mean, it's the most expensive natural disaster in the United States history, and yet it won't be for long. And I kept saying after the storm, if it had gone 90 miles east or 90 miles west and hit Atlanta or Charleston and Savannah, or Greenville as hard as it hit us, um, we would have seen a larger number of fatalities, because the people here in the mountains, like, we helped ourselves in a lot of ways. Um, we got our own tractors. We all had chainsaws. I had a stash of fuel. I mean, I was giving out toothbrushes to plumbers because they weren't sleeping at home, because they were traveling all over to get everybody's uh, wells and water systems back up and running. We were just a little more prepared because we live a little bit further away from these large cities, and there's so many lessons in disaster preparedness that are sort of embedded in these human stories. I started saying this almost as like a joke, and then as I read the stories, I'm more and more convinced this is true, which is that this book could save lives because people will understand the severity of these disasters because we California has had tremendous devastation with fires, but they are also very well prepared to evacuate, to deal with them in ways that limit the loss of human life. And in regions like ours, um, there aren't as many ways to prepare. That was part of the problem after the storm, where it was like, if I-40 goes down and 26 goes down, it's pretty darn hard to get in or out.
Yeah,
Um, And so, yeah, I mean, and that's why I'm so grateful for all the support we've had. I mean, it's been crazy. We had Barbara Kingsolver actually chimed in our comments on our Instagram. I was like, hey now.
nice, nice.
And we had Jose Andres and we had Brad Meltzer and a bunch of people who chimed in to support it, give us signal boosts. But we need more. I mean, I think right now we need about 9,000 more to finish. We have about 2 weeks.
Yeah, so about midway through the campaign, is that where you are at the moment?
Yeah, yeah. It'll be the morning of the 17th, July 17th is when it's over. And I mean, we didn't even plan it this way, but it's a strange coincidence because that's also the anniversary of Congressman Lewis's death.
Oh wow, yeah,
And so I'm kind of hoping he's looking out for us on this one. We kind of need a win right now. Um, and I think this isn't this isn't a win for me. This is a win for a lot of people.
yeah, yeah. Uh, you mentioned that there's several people that have been part of it. Brian Michael Bendis, Matt Fraction, any other collaborators that you'd like to
I
shout out?
I want to shout them all out. I'm gonna get them all in front of me because it's just, and I say this in the most nonviolent way, it's murderers row of creators, and I'm just so grateful for all of their participation. I mean, like this wouldn't be possible without all of them stepping up. So I want to shout out everybody. We've got Jem, who's the guy I told you about, working with Greg Pak and Josh Adams, Pulitzer
Hmm.
Prize winner Josh Adams. I'll just throw that in there. Uh,
Yeah.
Corey Valancourt, who's a reporter, is working with Steve Orlando and June Kim. Jessica Stepedney is working with Matt Fraction and Aster D'Amico. Tara McIntosh from Clyde, North Carolina. She's working with Jean Luen Yang, Tien Pham, and Brianne Lowenson. Um, I'm working with Val. I'm doing a story about actually where the title come from, Islands in the Sky, um, which we can talk about in a second. And then Hannah Roy from Asheville is working with Brian Michael Bendis and Cap Ward. Nick Filardi, who we talked about, Shannon Bertram, his wife, is working with Brent Schoonover, doing the art. And we put some of those out on our socials the other day. So you can see some of the early work. It's really, really cool.
Mhm.
And then there's Matthew K. Manning, who actually, a lot of y'all have read his comics, right? He did like Batman and
Yeah.
the Turtles, right? But he's from Asheville, has a deeply personal story. He's working with Jarrett Rutland, who's also local, who did a fantastic print image from like of a it's almost like Bruegel-esque, this represented representation of the storm, and you can buy a signed and numbered print from it through the Kickstarter. And then we've got Dr. David Easterling, who you may know as the NOAA scientist at the NOAA office in Asheville during the storm. And we paired him with Nate Powell, my
Hmm.
longtime
Hmm.
collaborator, to do the science, to show what was behind this storm, and to explain about the preparation, the readings of it, things like that. I'm really excited about this because I think this is actually the first time he's ever written about the storm publicly since leaving NOAA. And then we've got Angie Stone, who's from Asheville. She's a hoot. I got to hang out with her at our kickoff. And she's with Alex Segura and David Hahn. And then we've got Suzanne Palmer, who is paired with Anthony Del Cole, also another Pulitzer Prize winner. And
Hmm.
Batcave got hit just so hard. Like you still can't really get through back. It's like a temporary road. And it's like I haven't had the it's like literally if you turn off the street that I live on and you turn to the left, that's Batcave, right? And even after all this time, I haven't had the heart to go down there because it has so many memories for me as a kid. It used to be the town that our exit was named for from the highway, right?
Mm-hmm.
So every time it was, exit 49A, Batcave, and like all the jokes, right? Since I
Right.
was like two, like to the Batcave, right? I mean, like all of it, right? And this is like a formative part of my life to then, um, you know, hey, get to write Batman stories from time to time. But then like I don't know if they meant to do this, but they took Batcave off the highway sign.
Hmm.
It's not on the exit sign anymore. It's almost like it really did wipe it off the face of the earth, you
Huh.
know?
Yeah.
Um, I, I I've only begun to process that. Like every time I get off the exit, I like complain to myself about it. Like, right, I have to change the sign. Um, but I mean that's kind of a representation of how things are right now. And so and we've got Laura Martin did colors for the cover that Dave Marquez did. David Marquez, which is just absolutely beautiful. We had a great talk about it during our panel at Heroes about
Hmm.
coloring that to reflect how dirty we all were.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't shower, we were constantly working outside, like we were just dirty. And Dave Marquez just did a fantastic job. And then Jonathan Marks Baravecchia comes in with this gorgeous variant cover um, of a father holding his child against the floodwaters. Uh, it's just we've been so fortunate um, to have so many creators being willing to participate. Um, and I'm just, it's I think going to be a really beautiful and special book. I think I hope it also kind of changes people's mind about crowdfunding comics, right? Like I think this whole
Mm-hmm.
getting back to our roots of just making comics and figuring it out and then finding the audience. That's something I really enjoy. It's risky, but it takes a lot more work. But I I I I think decentralization is going to be important in the future. And Jody Troutman did some lettering for us, and we'll do more, I imagine, as the art
Nice.
comes in.
A
So,
dream team. Lots of talent.
yeah, I mean that's I don't often send up the bat signal. So when I do, and when the rest of the team does, whether it's our managing editor Lauren Sankovic, um, our design, our production designer Chris Ross, the person who gives us all our visual directions and cues, Val Delandro, like Kelly Sue, Matt, like um, between us, we all know people, and they were all very, very kind to hear us out and participate.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Before we wrap the interview, anything that you'd like to say? You mentioned Islands in the Sky being the title, and I think you were gonna follow up on that a little bit.
Yeah, that was so before there was a book, we had to come up with a title. Like we had to it's almost like calling your shot in baseball. You're like, okay, we're gonna do that. And then you sort of
Hmm.
build the baseball or the whatever, the train on the tracks. Whatever mixed metaphor I can screw up today. Um, for me, the thing that stood out most that really defined everything about the storm to me was that day after and I hadn't, the storm kind of hit the day before, but then the real hurricane came in overnight into Friday morning.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I'd gone into town early Thursday morning to try and just get some extra supplies because I'm a little bit of a prepper. And it was strange because there didn't seem to be a sense of urgency around town. And I hope this is something Dr. Easterling can get into where NOAA sent out warnings, the Weather Service sent out warnings, but they weren't responded to on a local level. And there's some unfortunate political circumstances actually having to do with book bans and libraries as to why they didn't. And so I get home and the power's flickering and I'm putting things away and things like that. And so um I go to bed that night and like the dog just was not having it. It
Oh.
was just so much noise. I mean, the wind was so loud. There was debris flying everywhere. And I'm in a rock house on the top of a hill, so I feel pretty safe. And we're hunkered down in the bedroom and um, we don't sleep particularly well. And by the time the morning comes, you're up at dawn, um, maybe a couple hours of sleep, and the power is out, the cell phones are out, there's no way to reach anybody. And then, they'll flicker a little bit, flicker off. And then finally, you just realize you can't talk to anybody. And I'm talking to the dog. That's like the only person I have to talk to. And unfortunately, the dog doesn't talk back. Um, and finally, I get out my mother's old uh, battery powered radio because the wind's still whipping. Like you can't go outside um, because the limbs are being thrown off of trees at like 20 and 30-degree angles so that they're basically flying across from forest area to forest area like missiles, right?
Mhm.
And you can tell, like, you can sort of see the floodwater in the distance from the creek at the bottom of the hill. It's that high, right? I should never be able to see it, right? It should be so far down the hill that you can't even tell there's a creek down there. But it had gone up that high that it was cresting near the top of that hill. Um, and so I get the radio out and I find the batteries and I turn it on and there's nothing. That was when it got so scary, right? Because you're
Mhm.
scrolling through all the channels and all of a sudden you realize it's not just the batteries, it's not just the power that's out, it's not the phone lines that are down. It's like not even shortwave radio or anything you can pick up, right? None of the stations are broadcasting, and you're sort of like, is this an apocalypse?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I get through the FM radio and then I give up for a little while and then I try again later. And it's finally like, I don't know, 8, 12 hours into this. I pick up a little AM frequency on the radio from a church on top of one of the mountains. And the preacher's sort of naming people who are missing and who people are looking for and making community announcements. We can't find so and so. Can you check on this property? Can you, see if the family member's okay, or like, if anybody's here, can you call this number, or like, just sort of those things that you think you do that maybe make you feel better than actually like solve a problem, help you find somebody.
Mhm.
And finally, he says, he said, here in the mountains, we're known as the land of sky. But tonight, for now, we are all islands in the sky.
Mhm.
And started crying when I heard that, man.
Yeah.
And I felt so alone and realized in a way that I'd never understood before how courageous it was for my mother to live out here by herself, keeping up this farm. It's just so many reflections on life that come in that moment where you realize like we're all stranded and it's been a day and we're still like no one can get on the roads, no one can get anywhere, and you're like, what is going to happen? Um, And that's where the title came from, because that is that was what I wrote my story about, and that was the first story we had done, and that was um, that was just the emotion of it. The it summed up everything we went through. You know?
Oh, it's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's get it funded so that everybody can feel it and everybody can understand it, and we can give some people who've had a rough go slightly better go. Um, have them do something that is fun, but also rewarding and cathartic. I've been kind of amazed at how openly people are like, this feels like therapy too, right? This book can heal. Um, and like I said earlier, I'm not kidding. I think this book might save your life.
Oh, oh. Stories are powerful, and comics are a powerful way to tell stories, and certainly glad to amplify that, and glad to amplify this project. I hope it's the first of many to come. We've talked about some of the erasure of stories that have happened, and there are lots of narratives in the region to be told. So I hope they find a place in the Appalachian Comics Project.
Me too. And every copy we sell and every dollar we raise, it just brings us one step closer to being able to tell one more person's story and bring it to the um, places that need to hear it the most.
Well said, and I love the mission. Have we missed anything that you want to make sure to include?
No, I mean, I think if we keep going, I'll probably have to pay you for the therapy. Um, but
Anytime, anytime. I'm a listener, fellow resident of the region. Yeah, I'm glad for conversation anytime.
yeah, I appreciate it, Jason. And I'm glad you guys were okay. I know you guys got hit too, and keeping your students uh, cared for during this difficult time is incredibly important. You're doing the Lord's work. Keep it up. Anything I can do to help, holler. Always happy to talk to the class or uh, give them whatever insight I can into some of these things that we dream up and then turn into books and stories and projects and worlds and um,
Awesome. Awesome. Many, many thanks. You were talking about that community outreach and how things become positive, and you saw some positivity there, and I saw that too. I saw people in the school community reaching out, helping each other, and keeping in touch that way. So it's a powerful part of who we are as well.
yeah, yeah. No, the I think many people's lives were saved by how close knit the community is in the mountains, and um, people are checking on everybody and sharing. And I think we need a little bit more of that these days. I think if we can tell our story of what we went through during the storm, but also after, and continue to do, then maybe we'll give everybody else a little inspiration about how to live their lives and run our country a little better too.
Absolutely. Uh, Positive futures ahead. Let
Right.
us hope. Let
Yes.
us hope.
It's our only choice is to be hopeful.
That's right. Well, many thanks again. It's always a delight to talk with you, and so glad to share about this project.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate you talking to me.